great news. Shelly, I'm going to kick it over to you, and why don't you share some news with the group?
Okay, I know that during this time we don't have much to smile about, but today around noon we got a call from the Minnesota Pollution Control, and we have our permit back. We've been in a permit situation to expand a dairy for now. We've been working on it for about 4.5 years. It got a permit last year. It bounced back via a lawsuit to the state level. So now twice we've been approved to build a dairy or expand our dairy. 2 different governors, 2 different Minnesota Pollution Control commissioners. So I think that seems that it is solid. That's a good thing for us. However, you know, given the events that have happened to all of us, it'll be quite a while before anything really moves on this. We're walking through some murky waters altogether. So, but we appreciate all the help and support from my dairy family, along with all the other ag commodity groups that have reached out to help support us in this endeavor. So much appreciated, and a little good news for all of us who've been working on this project. Thank you.
Yeah, well deserved, and feel free to come off mute and give a cheer or holler. But still a long road to go, as you heard, but I think finally the right decision. So without further ado, we can talk more to Shelly at the end. I want to get to our first presenter. So Will, we'll turn it over to you. Feel free to introduce yourself, and thank you so much, Will, Shauna, and Jaime, for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to come give a little check-in onto what's happening with international dairy markets. I've got a few slides here for reference, and I'll go through a little bit of just some things that I think would be useful for you all to know about the international dairy market right now. But, you know, just background for me, I actually grew up in the Midwest, although not a Minnesotan, so don't hold it too much against me as an Iowa corn and soybean farmer, but eventually made my way out here to DC, where essentially the economist now for the U.S. Dairy Export Council. But, you know, first off, as we get going, you know, I've heard it said a lot in the press, at least initially, and some industries, some popular, that exports are shut down. I do want to say that's not really true. To the extent that we are hearing pullbacks, they are happening, but it's, you know, exports are fighting a lot of headwinds right now, but they're not completely stopped. Product is still moving across the border, across to all of our major markets. So that's kind of the first thing I just want to get, you know, straight through before we talk about some of those headwinds that are facing U.S. dairy exports. The second thing is also, we don't have trade data yet for a lot of the major impacts due to COVID-19. Trade data tends to have a lag, so we've only got through February right now. We will get March data in a couple weeks, so y'all can have me back then. But, you know, for right now, you're relying somewhat on conversations we're having with folks in the market and kind of our own data analysis. And the final thing is, you know, quite a few folks probably don't spend as much time looking at trade data as I do. So just to kind of give you a brief overview, you know, U.S. dairy exports aren't a monolith. We export around the world to pretty much all the continents and a lot of different products. We export skim milk powder, non-fat, cheese, whey, lactose. Mexico's our biggest market, but we ship a lot of non-fat and whey to Southeast Asia, a lot of cheese to North Asia, Japan, South Korea. So that's kind of just real 50,000 foot overview of that. But kind of going to the international situation and what's happening right now, Morgan, if you want to flip to the next slide, there's a demand pullback internationally. The world market is facing a lot of the same pressures that the U.S. market is facing too. Food service and retail, you know, food service is shut down. Retail is going strong, but it's not enough to make up for that food service demand drop, unfortunately. We are hearing reports that a few processing facilities internationally of confectioner manufacturing and that sort of thing are being shut down, or they're seeing less demand too, so they're not ordering as much dairy ingredients. Additionally, in countries where they are big producers as well as importers, places like Mexico, China, rather than putting their domestic milk production into fresh milk or into yogurts or things that were being used and being purchased a lot, it instead got shifted towards the milk dryer. So now they're no longer buying as much milk powder, skim milk powder, non-fat dry milk as much as they were before. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So overall, this is all kind of creating a situation where there's just less demand on the global market. So US DEC is projecting somewhere between a 1% to 4% drop in global trade this year. That may not sound like a lot on the surface, but it does make a major impact and is relatively unprecedented. Even in the worst of the 2014-15 crisis, global trade only really dipped for about 2 months. We're projecting it to dip for about the next year, unfortunately. So you can see on this graph roughly what the range is for what we're expecting. The fundamental issue is that no market is unscathed by COVID-19. When the US had a trade war with China, the US could go look and try and find other markets. We could try and move more away from what was being shipped to China to try and move it more to Southeast Asia. When the US was facing tariffs on cheese to Mexico, we could ship more cheese to Japan and South Korea. Now the issue is a number of our buyers are pulling back how much product they want, and there's not an obvious next market up that we can go to. And so that's the simplest way of, we are facing headwinds in the export market. I'm going to focus on just one major headwind, and that's what's happening in Mexico. I think that's where a lot of the rhetoric of exports being shut down has come from, because it's probably one of the most severe impacts that we're having from COVID-19. So Morgan, if you want to head to the next slide. What's going on in Mexico is there's a lot going on. One, they're facing the normal COVID pressures. Food service is shut down. They eat a lot of cheese. They go out to eat a lot. That's shut down. So it's shifting to retail, and that's not quite enough to make up for food service demand drop. But the other issue that's happening in Mexico is their economy is under severe stress right now. Some of that has to do with the fact that their current president has an unorthodox economic policy, shall we say, that's not very favorable to the economy. President Lopez Obrador. That's part one. Part two is, I'm sure you will have all seen the news on oil prices going negative, essentially. But even before then, oil prices were under severe strain, and Mexico is a big oil producer, and so the government gets a lot of revenue there. Additionally, they were just fundamentally economically unstable before then, or not so much unstable, just there was a lot of underlying weakness within the Mexico's economy. They were actually negative in 2019 before all this COVID issues happened. Now with that, we're expecting them to decline by about 10% probably this year. IMF says 6% GDP decline. I think they'll be worse than that. But all of this is building up into a devaluing peso. The Mexican peso is getting weaker. And what that means for dairy is they just can't import as much product going forward. So you see on this chart, that part in the blue is really just this past month. The peso has dropped dramatically, and that makes imports more expensive. So as a result of that, they're having to pay more for imported product. Morgan, if you want to go to the next slide. They haven't seen the same price decline that the rest of the world has really been experiencing, or that the US has, and I know you folks are seeing here too. This is the CME non-fat dry milk price for US dollars and for the peso. They should be running together. It's only really small movement. But then as you see kind of here towards that last few months, bizarrely, the peso actually increased at the same time the dollar, the non-fat in dollar terms was decreasing. And now it's come back a little bit as the peso has stabilized. But what that means is again, they're just not going to import as much. So despite the fact that on the CME, non-fat is at 81 cents today, to Mexican buyers, it looks like it's $1.10. So it's just more expensive to import. So they probably won't import as much non-fat cheese, butter, etc. Morgan, if you want to go to the next slide. But why this matters is Mexico's our biggest market. They buy about half of our non-fat dry milk / skim milk powder. They buy almost exclusively non-fat. They buy about a quarter of our cheese, and they are also by far our largest export market. When Mexico pulls back, we need to find homes for that product elsewhere, and it's tough to make up large declines in Mexico buying around the world. So I think that is probably where you were seeing a lot of the rhetoric of people saying exports have dried up. It is because Mexico was pulling back, and I think that's the case still. But I don't think they are pulling back completely. They will still buy U.S. dairy, but they will be buying less this year than they did last year. But it isn't all doom and gloom. Morgan, if you want to go to the next slide. I do want to leave you all just with a few main points because I think it's most interesting to have a Q&A here. But, as I said, exports are still moving, but demand is challenged internationally overseas, just like it is here. And because of that, competition's fierce. Europe is experiencing very much the same issues that we are. They have a backup of cheese and butter as well. They're putting more milk into milk powder dryers with that butter skim stream. So we're going to face more competition internationally, so we have to be even more competitive. But positively, I will say we are hearing that the U.S. is moving more fat and cheese over. We are moving butter and cheese exports increasingly around the world. Part of this has to do with the U.S. is more exposed to the loss of food service than Europe is. More of our cheese and butter goes into food service here in the United States than it does in Europe. And because of that, our prices are now lower than Europe. And so we're getting some of their sales. We are capturing market share in these areas. And I will say, competition is fierce, but we are capturing market share, or at least working to do so. I am optimistic that we can increase. We are very competitive in the world, but it's a tough market to do that in right now. The other thing I will say, positive note, whey demand is holding up okay right now. I know that doesn't make as big of an impact on farmer milk checks, but it does still factor into class 3. And, it is important for maintaining balance within the U.S. Supply. And overall, China is now returning to buying after they really pulled back quickly as a result of first the U.S.-China trade war and then the African swine fever, where they lost about half their pig population, which was a big consumer of the world's whey. So now they're starting to rebuild that, and they are buying some more whey, as well as the U.S.-China phase 1 deal is helping there too. But fundamentally, I do believe, and certainly we do here at the Export Council, that if we're going to rebalance the U.S. dairy market, which we certainly have a lot of products here domestically, we've got to export it. As we go forward, I think exports will allow us to get there quicker. The positive news on cheese and butter fat are good. The issue is so much of our cheese and butter were geared for the domestic market. Both 95% roughly were here in the U.S. So if we lose, let's say 10% off cheese and butter demand in the U.S. market, we basically have to triple our exports of cheese. And so that's some of the headwinds that we're facing. We at the Export Council are working to try and move as much product and encourage demand for U.S. dairy. I know a lot of the members and co-ops and processors are doing a great job right now trying to work through it. I know we've got tough times ahead with a lot of challenges, but exporting is the way that we can try and get back to a balanced situation. But I think it'll take a while, unfortunately. So that's it for me. I don't know if Lucas, if you want to open up for questions or if you had anything top of mind to start off with.
Yeah, no, we'll let the experts here answer questions. So just respectfully take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask Will a question. We've got about 10 minutes.
Hi, Will. This is Dave Buck. Thank you for joining us today. Does the USMCA have any effect on our exports in this situation, either negatively or positively?
So USMCA certainly is not a negative on our exports. For me, USMCA's biggest victory was ensuring that we had access to the Mexican market. And it's maintained that. It helps with good relationships between the two, between the US and Mexico, and we are still very much active in the country as we try and rebuild demand there. I wouldn't say it has too much of an impact there. The question will be whether it allows us to have more access into the Canadian market. There were a number of positives in restricting some of their their dumping of skim onto the world market, and I think that's a major victory. It hasn't been fully implemented and gone into effect yet, but it will. And Canada's going to have the same issue that we are here in the US, where they're going to have too much skim that they want to export. But because of provisions within USMCA, that will restrict them from doing so, or at least at below market rates. So that is actually a very good thing. So you won't see it right now, and perhaps we won't see increased exports to Canada right away. But the positive is we're going to make sure that we're stopping Canada from being unfair in international markets so that we can keep moving product overseas.
Thanks. And I should mention we have also Shauna Morris and Jaime Castaneda on, who work more on kind of policy and regulatory. So William is kind of the market expert, as I understand, but those two are here to answer.
Yeah, I will defer all policy and negotiation and political questions to the two of them, and I'll happily answer any market or export data questions. So.
We are not hearing anything. We do have our friend from the pig industry on, or the swine industry, and Will, ramifications for what's happening in U.S. swine and worldwide swine on dairy and that portion that goes to piglets, is that major as much as African swine fever was last year, for example?
It won't be as big of an impact, although I will say the U.S. does use more whey per piglet than China does. But the scale of African swine fever within China, and I know the pig expert will be more able to answer this than me, but they were half the world's pig population prior to ASF, and they were the world's biggest buyer of whey globally. They imported about half the world's whey trade, and roughly half of that was going towards the pigs, if not more. So I think it is worth noting that, when China pulled back, that was a major loss of the international market for whey. To me, it's unclear as to how much the U.S. uses domestically here for pigs. I haven't looked at it too closely, but we do use it widespread, whereas China was only the bigger farms. So I'm not too sure, but I will say it will be a major impact if you see a similar reduction in scale. But just by virtue of how many pigs were lost in China, I don't imagine it would be as large.
Other questions for Will, Jaime, or Shauna?
Say, Lucas.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I finally figured out how to get it off mute. Well, this is Steve Schlung, and say thanks, Will, for joining us. Your presentation was very interesting. You had talked about the Mexican peso and how weak that is against our dollar. How about the other currencies around the world? And I have heard that our dollar is really strong against almost all of them, and that the stimulus package might help with that some. What would be your input on that?
Yeah. So the dollar is very strong internationally. The thing to remember, I would say, about currencies, and especially the US dollar, is when things are uncertain. When people don't know where the global economy is headed, they search for safety. And one of those key safe havens is the US dollar. And so that's partly why you've seen the dollar strengthen so rapidly. It has strengthened against a number of importing currencies as well, especially in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, all have had weakening currencies. Mexico's has been the most severe because their economy is troubled. It's not just COVID-19 related worries about insecurity where people are going to the dollar and the dollar strengthening. This is also a distinct weakening of the peso that has a lot to do with oil revenues and that underlying economic weakness. So you may see let me think how to put this. So in those Southeast Asian markets, namely Indonesia and Malaysia, with the dollar strengthening, they will probably buy perhaps a little bit less than they would assuming a weak dollar or just a moderate dollar level, but it's not impacting purchasing decisions to the same extent that the peso's decline has.
Well, thanks for that answer. Just one follow-up. In the Middle East, they've always supplied mostly oil as their income over there, oil sales, and they're really down with the low price of oil, and they've been one that would buy a lot of powder, and only buy powder if they could afford it. How much does that affect the sales to the Middle East of powder for the U.S.?
Yeah. So the U.S. doesn't sell much powder directly to the Middle East anymore. That tends to be Europe's backyard. They sell most of their powder to the Middle East. But I will say, you're absolutely right on the Middle East is really reliant on oil revenues. And so the collapse in oil prices, it will have a big impact on their demand overall. So if they buy less from Europe, that means Europe's looking to sell more internationally as well, especially to our other key market in Southeast Asia and South Asia. We should sell quite a bit to as well. The US sells a lot more cheese to the Middle East. Lower US cheese prices are encouraging Middle Eastern buyers to source from the US, but I think that's also where you'll see more pullback. By virtue of that tends to be a more expensive good where people have to go out and buy it in grocery stores and in retail right now. So I think you're absolutely right on that. Oil is kind of affecting around the world a lot of different powder markets, even ones that we don't traditionally think of, like Nigeria, is going to be impacted there as well.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. And if there's no questions, I'd ask Jaime and Shauna to just say hi and how US DEC is funded. And if you want to get in touch with any of them, I can get you in touch anytime. But Shauna?
Well, hi, I'm not sure if Jaime's unclicked yet or not. And thanks so much, Lucas, for letting us join today to listen in, hear if there's any questions. Thought William did a great job answering the USMCA one earlier. We're keenly watching the timing of implementation and especially some of the key details of that agreement moving forward to help ensure that we get those types of disciplines on Canada that the US works so hard to try to establish under the agreement. Anybody that has a policy-related question or wants to pick our brains can reach out directly to us, or Lucas can certainly help you connect to us. So thanks again, Lucas.
Just want to say hi. This is Jaime Castaneda. Like Shauna, we play a double role or dual role with national milk producers. Just want to say hi to everyone, and especially to those who ship their milk to co-ops, to let them know that your co-ops are doing a fantastic job. Talking to National Milk all the time, letting us know how bad the situation is out there, and we're trying to actually make sure that USDA does, and Congress does actually as good as a job as possible to try to compensate some of the losses of farmers. And I also have to give kudos to Lucas and to the association because it's a great partner to work with.
Well, thanks, Jaime. Checks in the mail. Thank you, Will. Thanks, Shauna. And with no further ado, feel free to stay on, and we can always get in touch with you later, though, if there's questions by email, of course. With no further ado, we'll go to our pig expert, Mr. Preisler, who comes from a dairy farm in northwest Minnesota originally. Dave, I'll let you go ahead, but just so everyone knows, we talked for, I think, almost an hour this morning. Garrett was also on that call, Garrett Luthens. So if you have more questions, I can try to answer them later, but our time is short here this morning. So we're going to give Dave 20 minutes because we have this serious situation. And if that's not enough time, we'll follow up with his himself or his staff later. So Dave, please take it away.
Thanks, Lucas. Can you all hear me fine?
Yes, sounds great.
Perfect. And I guess the only other thing, and I just want, because I'm not sure exactly who's on the call, and I know we don't want to take time for that, but my only ask would be that, I mean, that none of this like could show up in the press or that sort of thing. So
we do have, Dave, we do have one dairy newspaper, but they know everything on this call is for background only and no quotes and no attribution unless they would follow up with you. So the Dairy Star, and they're real good to work with. So we're all on the same page.
Perfect. All right, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just frame it up with a few numbers just to start with. Is that the normal capacity in this country, packing plant capacity to kill pigs, the maximum, if everything is working just perfectly, is to do about 500,000 head of market pigs per day in the United States. Okay. Currently, we're producing to go into that about 475,000 pigs per day. This week, we are down to the point where we only have capacity that is operating of 350,000 head a day. Okay? And by Monday, that number is going to be 325,000 head a day as far as capacity that will be up and still operating. So you can see just with very simple math, we have a complete non-matchup with market-ready pigs and available shackles to process them. And we're getting behind by about 125 to 150,000 head of pigs a day. And as each day this week is gone, that spread between available pigs and shackle spaces, it just keeps getting wider. And quite honestly, and we're going to have 2 plants that are going to close on Monday in other states. And so that's why it's going to bring it down from the 350 it is today down to 325. So we literally have got every single day, and this has been a moving number, but every single day right now, we don't have a home for, let's say, 125 to 150,000 pigs. This has been something that's been going on very gradually for about 3 weeks now, 3.5 weeks, but it's become more acute in the last 5 days, is when we really lost a lot of capacity. There has only been one plant that has come back out of this and is trying to get going again, and that's in Columbus Junction, Iowa. They started back after being closed for 2 weeks. They are trying to come back here this week. Sounds like this week so far has gone well. No one else has successfully come back yet, and we're still waiting to see how that's going to occur. So that puts us at a really difficult spot. We've made farmers over the last few weeks have kind of, actually about the last month, when they kind of saw some of this possibly coming, some tried to market ahead. We've already chewed through all of that. Many farms were trying to slow pigs down, and in fact, I'd say almost all. We're kind of chewing through that too. You can only hold them so long, and then you've got other pigs that are pushing them from the back end out of the nursery, and so there's got to be a place for those to go. We do have farms that are euthanizing young pigs and aborting sows, but that is not going to do us any good whatsoever till probably 4 to 6 months down the road. But there are farms that are making that decision now, because we don't know what it's going to look like 4 to 6 months from now. And at least at that point, you put in or invested the minimum amount of money into the pig. We do have a farm in to localize it. We do have a farm in Minnesota that put down 3,000 head of over 300-pound market pigs this week. They're going to do another 3,000 head next week. And we have a couple of other farms between them. They're going to put down 40,000 head next week. And that's just the ones that we know about. I think we're just on the very tip of the iceberg of what's going to come. We are creating plans over the next 2 weeks to try and absorb somehow about 200,000 market-ready pigs just within Minnesota. And I think that number at this point might be on the low side. This is going to become really more acute as we look at next week, the week after, and the week after, because farms by that time just really have completely run out of choices. So that is happening. It's real. We are having discussions with our government about it, state government, and we've been having these discussions for 3 weeks. But state government and federal government, quite honestly, I think until you end up actually killing market-ready pigs that are healthy, they're no longer going to the food chain, that's when it finally gets people's attention. I'd say no different than when you have actual video of milk being dumped. That's when it starts to get people's attention rather than just, you laying that warning out there. So our latest ask, and we've gone through a bunch of things that we think would be helpful, but we've gotten to the point where, and just to kind of keep this brief, is that we are pursuing, asking our government, our national organizations are doing this, we're doing this, to see if on a federal level that the administration will enact the Defense Production Act and federalize pork processing plants, with the goal of, if there are enough employees, healthy employees, to continue to turn pigs into food, we'll do that. If there are not, then to look at running a skeleton crew at the plants to at least humanely euthanize those pigs, and then we will deal with the carcasses either through landfilling, composting, or rendering. I will tell you, this is a pretty good indication of what's going on. In Minnesota and in Iowa, all the rendering capacity is spoken for next week. And we know that that is only going to be a partial solution. And so that just kind of is what it is. We're going to have kind of a multiple solution to deal with this. I'd say from a problem analysis standpoint, 80 to 90% of our problem and most immediate attention needs to get put to depopulation. The farm that put those pigs down did it with gunshot. It took 20 people a day and a half to put down 3,000 pigs. And these are, again, 300 plus pounders. And then they all moved off to rendering. But that filled rendering at that rendering plant for 2 days. Okay. So that's where we're at. We don't see, unfortunately, another way through this than trying to gradually work through it. And I don't have any other better description to call it than an absolute tragedy. Farms are doing the absolute best they can and do it in a humane way. But our hand is just really forced at this point. If we don't get the Defense Production Act piece, then those pigs are going to have to be put down on the farm. And that job is absolutely massive that's in front of us. And we're just going to have to figure our way through it. And we don't have any perfect answers for that. But I think if you could just imagine, as dairy farmers yourself, next week, putting down, half of the cows in the state, and how you would actually logically do that. It's a lot easier on paper than it is once you actually have to do it. So I'm going to probably stop there maybe and make sure that I'm answering any questions that your group has. I did have, and I appreciate Lucas's support. We did have a good call this morning for, just like you said, about an hour. We did lay out a set of asks. If other groups could help us, one of the asks is to help work with the governor to provide us some kind of media cover for this whole thing. He has told me that he would do that. We'll see how that goes, and because we're going to need it badly. Because this is not going to be easy to handle from a media standpoint. Because unfortunately, this is a complete waste of food. But that's where we're at right now. I look for this to continue not only with pigs but also in other species. Some of you may have already seen that Jenny-O is going to close down in Welmer for a little while, and we'll see where that brings them. And we'll go from there. But like I said, I won't get into all the other specific asks because I already went through that with Lucas this morning on the phone. Other than the thing that really changed between now and then is that this whole piece of asking for the Defense Production Act to be enacted by the president, federalize this thing. I had a conversation with Colin Peterson this morning. He promised he would call Secretary Perdue, and also had a conversation with our governor. And I'm told that he did bring this up to, in fact, he said he brought this up to Vice President Pence. And so we'll see where things go from there. I'll stop and take any questions that people have.
Thanks. Any questions for Dave? And I think I can say, Garrett, all the asks, none of the asks I think were inconsistent with anything we wouldn't be pushing for. So we will be sure to weave them in because they are a user of milk. And obviously, like Dave said, it could spill over to our industry. Any questions for Mr. Preisler? And thank you, Dave, for being on.
I'm just curious what's I guess the process or what's being done already to help.
I have a question. I don't know if it's specifically for him. This is Jim Sulphur. I gotta just.
Sorry, I think there were two people there at once.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure who was speaking first, but if you want to finish your question, and Mr. Sulphur, we can't hear you or you stop. Just wait a little bit, please.
Lucas, Chris Sigurdsson, I think I started the question first.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, my question is, what's being done or what needs to be done to help the plants get up and running again? I'm just curious what that looks like, and what in line in terms of support or processes can help in that regard. We're all seeing them close. Just wondering what's missing. What's the missing piece of the puzzle to help them get up and running again, or is that not really even going to be possibilities in the short term to cause that to happen?
Yeah, each situation is a little bit different, and the reason for that is that each state, their Department of Health has got some different responsibilities as we look at the human health side. Some of it's very localized, so it's done at the county health level, and others it's more centralized at the state. So I'll just use the example that we're sitting at right now with the JBS plant in Worthington. Okay? That plant does normally 20,000 head a day. They were getting a spike in positives that, not unmanageable, but there was a spike that was occurring within their workers. They did work with the Minnesota Department of Health, and the Minnesota Department of Health was very helpful and worked in a collaborative way to do interventions. So they were taking temperatures of employees twice a day. They were, employees are in full PPE, whole host of things that they implemented. It seemed to be going well. Okay? Then the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry decided to show up and kind of blew the whole damn thing up. And so you had conflicting state agencies or conflicting messages from state agencies. And JBS just felt they could not operate under that constraint, and so they pulled the pin to close. And so that has been one of our battles, is to work with competing state agencies, at least on a state level. There's some similar things occurring in other states, but more of that ends up being some county health folks that have kind of gone off the deep end. And there are other situations too, where you have some plants that they have so many positive workers that they literally can't run. Okay, so it's kind of a mix of things. And then some plants are deciding to close, very early in an infection for just a few days and try and get ahead of it and then open back up. And that's what Prime Pork did in Wyndham. So they were only closed for 3 days, and now they came back up today. I think that's what Genio is going to attempt to do. And then we'll see how that ends up going. But it's really a mixed bag. So if we look at Smithfield's been closed for a while now. They had the CDC actually come in and do a report and a set of recommendations. Smithfield's looking at those right now and seeing what they can implement. But there it's going to end up, quite honestly, being more of a political thing. There's going to need to be an agreement between the mayor of Sioux Falls, the governor of South Dakota, the CDC, the Department of Health in South Dakota, Smithfield, and probably the union to figure out how to bring that thing back up. And so that is a work in progress, and we'll see how that ends up going. There's been pretty massive intensive testing now in Worthington with the JBS plant. They're hoping to get a lot of those results back now here, kind of starting Sunday and Monday, and then depending what those test results are, JBS will kind of take next steps from a standpoint of deciding where they can go, just depending on what the positives are. And I think that's going to be a big decision right there, or a big data point that they can then make a decision on. So long answer to your question, but it's really a mix of things on how we look at bring them back up. And it's very new as far as having any plant come back up. So there's a beef plant in Greeley, Colorado. It's been closed for a couple of weeks. They're bringing it back up today. There was a beef plant in Pennsylvania that was closed for a while. They brought that back up on Wednesday. So the first of the plants to bring back up again in the United States are just happening this week. And I think it'll be kind of instructive on how some of that ends up working.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Good question, Chris. Mr. Sulfur, if you didn't fall away.
No, I got a question. This is unrelated to that, I guess. Is I got the phone. I brought conversations. If you guys can hear me, 3 conversations in the last week or so from dairy farmers along that line. Does anybody know the capacity we have to slaughter cows? And are we going to be in? Is there any information or any thoughts or opinion? Are we going to? And I get it, if plant goes down, so this question was long prairie, going to go down. I don't know. Does anybody know where we're sitting from that standpoint?
Anybody answer that question? One of my thoughts was to have cattlemen and beef on next week, but I can find out in the interim. Of course, we don't have much in Minnesota, but not all of it stays here.
I will share with you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I will share with you that if the Department of Labor and Industry continues to approach this like they are starting to with this plant, they'll bring us back to the Stone Ages on how we handle plants from a standpoint of plant speed and efficiency. So if they insist that that's the only way to do it, we will no longer be competitive in the state to process animals, period. So there are some consequences there that we've got to work through. And I've been very direct with the government about it.
Any last question for Dave? Otherwise,
Dave,
I really, go ahead.
This is Dave Buck. I don't really have a question, I guess, just thank you for all you do for the hog industry and everyone, and just thanks for being here with us and sharing that. I mean, it's, everybody's struggling with all of this, and of course, everybody looks at their own industry, and this was kind of eye-opening for me about the severity of the problem you guys are facing. So we certainly wish you the best, and if you need some help, if we can be of help, Minnesota Milk, just let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I really appreciate that. And like Lucas said, I mean, I grew up on a dairy farm. I milked cows all the way through college. And I'm a firm believer that all of us are in this together. And that's just what I believe. And I think we're better off together than we are apart. And it was just kind of interesting. I was listening, to your export report. It is almost identical to what we're going through, from an export standpoint and also from a food service standpoint. I mean, you could almost take the words, ham and bacon and shoulders and so on and insert it into whey and butter and cheese. I mean, so we're all in this together, and the dynamics are very, very similar from the standpoint of demand for ag products.
Well, thanks so much, Dave, and we'll be in touch, and get some sleep. So, not that you need it, but you deserve it.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
With that, I think Laura Lemke's online of Minnesota Grain and Feed Association. Laura, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, have you been on 2 years or 3 years there as executive director? And Laura, as we said, we had some questions about just the situation with feed and any regulation you're under due to COVID. The availability of byproducts, I know, was a big concern that our dairies feed. And again, like we just heard from Dave, anything we can do to help you at the state or federal level, help you help us, since we're in this together. Feel free to go ahead, and thanks for joining.
Hey, Lucas, thanks for having me on. And just as a correction, I'm just actually just finished up my first year as executive director for the association, although I have been on staff for almost 15. So that being said, right now, as far as red tape goes for the grain and feed industry, we're not really encountering any. Obviously, we're considered essential, but at our facilities, we are using social distancing practices. A lot of facilities are asking their customers to, asking their customers to call in orders, stay in their vehicles if they're going to come pick up feed, make payments, either ACH or credit card, something like that, just to try and keep employees safe. As far as feed mills go, they're keeping office staff separate from mill staff or plant staff, just to keep things separate as best they can. But for the most part, we are pretty much business as usual. I spent a good part of the week making phone calls to a lot of our feed mill members and have asked them, how's the dairy situation? How's the dairy feed situation going? And many of them mentioned that with ethanol plants going offline, that DDGs had been short. And so there have been a lot of some changes, depending on where you were at, there had been some changes in rations. Some indicated that it was more of an issue than others. But it sounds like now DDGs are getting to be easier to come by. It sounds like soy hulls and wheat mids are especially hard to get right now. They've gotten very expensive. Animal protein products, they're expecting more challenges there, especially with processing plants going down. So that's also become a concern. But for right now, nobody is seeing any huge issues with it. They are trying to be flexible and use different products if one becomes more expensive, and they're adjusting things as best they can. Now, if we talk about things on the hog side, that's where we start to see a lot more concerns. I don't know if Dave dropped off or not, but I've actually had more concerns about that than the dairy situation. And maybe this is, I don't mean this in a terrible way, but dairy's been having challenges for many years. So a lot of my feed mill members have said, we have really good relationships with our dairy customers. They communicate well. That really hasn't been an issue. It's, I hate to say it, but business as usual. Although I did have some tell me that they expect with this coronavirus situation, some of those dairies that might be on the bubble might end up getting out, which I'm sure is something that you've seen anyway or will be seeing. As far as any of our state or federal asks, early on, we had asked for help with the seasonal CDL issue and a workaround with the driver and vehicle services offices being closed. We had been pushing for some way to be able to do that online for both seasonal CDLs and the issuance of new CDLs. Sounds like that has all been taken care of. We do have a lot of members who are active in the agronomy business as well. And that, right now, the agronomy side of things is fine. Everybody's working, everybody's in the fields as long as they can be, and that's been fine there. Another one of our initial asks, and this was both federally and on the state, when the discussion was concerning who is essential or not, we did ask for feed and pet foods to be considered, and we did get those. We did get that right from the get-go. So that's been good there. As far as how you guys could help the industry, stay operating. Try to pay your bills as best you can. Communicate with your feed mills about what your goals really are. That was one mill had said that, just be really upfront. If you're looking for cheap feed, just tell us. And be patient with a lot of these ingredients becoming more scarce or more expensive. The more notice you can give a mill on when you're going to need feed and what you're going to need will give them more time to source those ingredients and be able to deliver to you. And that's all I got.
Well, thanks, Laura. Sorry, I feel like you've been telling Dick what to do for a long time. So anyway, congratulations on 1 year. Any questions for Laura? And that's her predecessor, by the way. Any questions for Laura? I guess it's good to hear it's red tape and kind of bad to hear it's more supply that's choking it up, Laura. It sounds to me you didn't really mention, but at this point, profitability of mills, profitability of elevators, they're fine at the moment, I assume, based on what you just said. Are they seeing a pending fiscal cliff because of how hogs and dairy are doing, or are your members okay financially for the foreseeable future?
In my conversations, almost everybody said they're keeping a very close watch on their accounts receivable. On the dairy side, for the most part, they said, getting the bills paid this month doesn't look like a major issue. Next month might be a little questionable, especially once some guys see their milk checks. And on the hog side of things, though, that's where I've got some mills that feed a lot more hogs, and they are very, very concerned. And they have to be careful. They're kind of stuck in that hard spot, and it doesn't matter what species it is. if you have longtime customers that you've worked with for years, and now you have something like this come along, how do you turn your customers away? How do you tell them no? So those are some really difficult conversations that are likely to be had in the relatively near future. And we're going to have boards of directors and managers really watching this closely.
Well, I appreciate your time. Any quick questions for Laura? Otherwise, we can let her go. Well, thank you so much, Laura. We had several people wonder if there was red tape that we could help with. So good to know that so far so good. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Lucas.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, want to open it up kind of as we end. We'd love you to share something good, so you can do that. If you came on late, Shelley announced that the Department of Agriculture provided them back their permit at Daily Farms of Lewiston. So they'll move on to the next step in the continuing process. So that's pretty exciting. But anybody have any questions that we haven't covered or anything else to share, fun or otherwise?
Gary Luthen's here. The most exciting thing is Sunday's coming up and I can get my nails touched up by my daughter.
A Sunday
exciting.
spa day. That's awesome.
My brother Ben has his nails done too. I'll send you a picture.
All right, I've got a bright side. I'll share. I'm outside taking this conference call. It can't get much better than that. The sun is shining. It's literally a bright side. So get outside, everybody. Enjoy some, some UV rays and everything today. Obviously, wear sunscreen, be smart and all that stuff. Skin cancer is real, so there's your PSA for that. But I think it has been a pretty somber day, especially as Lucas alluded to earlier. We heard from Dave earlier, and my background, as many of you know, is in the swine industry, so it's kind of a double whammy, and I've got a lot of friends that are still in the industry, and just keep our pork farmer friends in your prayers this weekend, I'd ask you. And like Dave said, we're definitely all in this together, and we'll get through it. It's going to be kind of an icky, 2 weeks, but if we can each find something a little happy here, I think that's going to be best for us overall. So there's my 2 cents.
I'll probably go next. It just rained here, so there's a bright side. I'm actually going to say it because we needed some, and the lawn was looking pretty dry. So that's a thumbs up. It was short, it was quick, and they could keep rolling the field. So woo-hoo! And shout out to Lucas and Jenna, who are great teammates. We had a good week this week, so thank you guys.
I'm going to give you guys some virtual high fives. So bam, there you go, guys. Sorry for yelling. I got excited.
George is wondering what percent, who's got corn planted and what percent? Garrett says 0. Feel free to come off mute.
We have about 450 acres of about 1,800 done. So 800 acres of alfalfa with oats. So things are moving.
This is Dave, we'll finish oats today, hook up to the corn planter tomorrow, hopefully.
Yeah, they're hoping to put corn on Sunday, and Jeff's got 200 acres of, what was it, Kentucky ryegrass direct seeded. So he feels pretty proud of himself with that because our seeder's kind of small.
Our corn planter started rolling today. And the goal is to get 200 acres planted before it rains sometime. Don't know if that's possible or not, but I'm just the meal delivery person, so take my job seriously.
I joined the wrong way, but for you, those of you at a computer, we've been asked to sign on to a letter which I shared with the executive committee and Darren, we had them improve it. But all the ag groups have been asked by Minnesota Corn to sign on to a letter to cease roadside inspections and weight enforcement activities. So I'll send this out to our policy committee probably for more feedback. But the original language was a little more, I think, probably over the top, and they scaled it back some. So you wouldn't be able to pull over a truck just for an inspection or just for a weight enforcement. So if anybody's heard examples of that or has opinions, please share. There's a safety trade-off, of course, with our milk trucks, but I do think cops are bored. I got a ticket the other day. I haven't got one of those in a while. So anyway, if you got opinions, please share via email or now is fine. Otherwise, keep sharing fun stuff. It's great to hear.
Hey, Lucas, this is Chris. Can I go back to business just 1 minute, please?
Absolutely.
So what concerned me the most, well, there's so many things that concern me about the fellow that spoke about the hog travesty, but the regulatory agency fighting is the one that maybe we should recognize and proactively take some steps towards in case the same thing happens to one of the milk plants here in the state, which are obvious, potentially the same environment or situation that's causing these outbreaks could happen in those. So what can or should we be doing to make sure that people have, I guess, these different agencies which I don't understand any of that. That's where your guys' expertise comes in. What can we do to get ahead of that, to have these conversations now on if a plant goes down, what we're going to do or what are going to be the steps to help them get back up and going again?
Yeah, it's a good question, Chris. I mean, I think one of the things is our agriculture commissioner is and will be a good advocate for us. This morning when we had the call is the first time I learned of that. So I was thinking along the same lines as you, and it's very worrisome. So the other thing is our agriculture legislators know what Dave has shared with them, and pork being our largest livestock industry, I know they're listening. So I think we need to share the same messages that you just said, that this could spill over. So I foresee us communicating that out in a very careful way, because it's one of those things where you'd rather have the problem go away than they actually mentioned it on the governor's press conference yesterday. The Department of Labor called out JBS for saying they were not incentivizing their employees properly to come back to work when they were sick, which I thought, even if true, just not a very good time to throw them under the bus for an employee scenario when they're totally shut down. So my hope is, with Dave's relationship, with the agriculture's relationship with the governor, who's been very good and talked to us several times. I never talked to the previous governor once. I hope it kind of corrects itself, and it's one of those things where if we make a big public statement, we could almost make it worse. But I'd take advice from others on the phone, especially those in plants. But I would say you can do a lot by reaching out, but the minute we make it public, we can almost draw more scrutiny to it, and it could get worse. They could make I don't want to say liberal versus conservative, but more restrictive measures at the plants when people find out, what, you're only paying them, $14 an hour, I make 20 or whatever it is. So if you can reach out to your own legislators, that's helpful, I think.
Lucas, maybe I could add a little to that. This is Steve Schlangen.
Hey, Steve, yeah.
I'm not sure what what all regulatory agencies are overseeing those beef and pork processing plants, but I think in the dairy plants, aren't we more under the Food and Drug Administration and the Department of Agriculture mostly? And I think Clay Detlefson at the National Milk Producers Federation is chairman of that Food and Ag Committee with Homeland Security. And I know he's been working on things to, if we do run into issues at our milk processing plants, to find a way to get them started up as quickly as possible again. And I think a couple of things are different. I think the people are not, there's not near as many people working in a dairy plant as there would be in a meat processing plant, and they're spread out more. And it's just a way different environment, but it's definitely a concern. We got to make sure we try to keep those running as much as we can. But I think they're working hard to make sure that doesn't happen. But I agree, this industry, what was it, the Department of Industry and Labor? Or what was it? Was that a Minnesota?
Yeah, Dole, DOL. Yeah, they're normally, to your point, Steve, they're normally not involved with us, but actually with the farm safety stuff last year, they started to try to get their hands more involved. So they're trying, I think, to become more involved in agriculture.
Is that at the state level or national level?
State.
That's the state level. That's definitely something we need to focus on, I would say. And I don't know how to go about that, except probably going straight to the governor and making sure he knows our concerns.
Well, now that the lawsuits are starting, Smithfield is being sued in Missouri because of presumed poor working conditions, right? So, I mean, there's so many tentacles that are going to connect to this. That anyway, thank you.
Yeah, a good point and good focus for us. So we've got about 18 of us left on. Any other comments, questions? That was really good, Chris. Thanks for bringing that up.
And this is David. The only thing with the Department of Labor and Industry, yeah, it's a Minnesota agency. And their primary focus is worker safety, worker protections, things like that. And Department of Agriculture is more on the food safety side of the equation. So that's where the two pieces of the puzzle meet.
Thank you for clearing that up.
Well, thanks for your time, everyone. We're gonna, we do not always practice social distancing within our place of employment. So because of that,